Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone here on behalf of ODI to this event, co-hosted by the Markets in Crisis group on what happened to Market in Crisis. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to the people who are joining us online today. So this event will look at how humanitarians have embedded markets into their work, looking more specifically at three different crisis contexts: South Sudan, Pakistan, and Mali, each of them captured into a case study which copies are available on the shelf outside this room or online at odi.org. So today we have the pleasure to have four distinguished speakers. So I will start by Veronique, who is at my left. So Dr. Veronique Barbelet, so she's a research fellow in the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI, where she focuses on humanitarian policy, humanitarian negotiation with non-state actors, conflict and security, protection, gender-based violence, and livelihoods. A political scientist by training, Veronique previously worked as well with the World Food Programme. Right hand, we have Simon Levine, who is also a research fellow in the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI, where he specialized in livelihood, vulnerability analysis, land right, and early response in humanitarian crisis. Simon spent many years working with NGO in Mozambique, Cambodia, Tanzania, Burundi, before working as a consultant based in Uganda for 9 years. Next to Simon, we have Joe Zaramba, who is a development professional specializing in market analysis, market-based approaches, corporate responsibility, environmental practices. So Joe previously worked at Oxfam, advising on livelihood work in the Horn, East, and Central Africa, with special focus on supporting women livelihood and women role in marketplaces. And last but not least, we have Emily Anderson there, who is humanitarian advisor with DFID. So prior to her current role with DFID, Emily worked with Oxfam as an emergency food security and vulnerable livelihood advisor and market lead. Emily is also a co-author of the Market in Crisis case study from South Sudan that, as mentioned, is available on the shelf. So this case study is launched today alongside paper on markets in Pakistan and Mali. And myself, so I'm Ellen Dria. I'm an independent humanitarian consultant with specific interests on cash and markets, and I'll be your chair today. So before we start, I'd like to invite you to turn your phone on silent, but we are totally connected there, so we would encourage you as well to tweet. And the hashtag to the event is #CrisisMarkets. So this afternoon we'll hear first from Veronique and Simon. Veronique, if I'm not mistaken, will provide background to why HPG embarked on those three case studies. She will also talk about the mechanics of what happened to market in crisis with reference to those three examples we've mentioned, Mali, Pakistan, and South Sudan. Simon will take over, looking at what are the implications of those findings for humanitarian agencies, and we'll then hear from both Emily and Joe, who will share with us their thoughts on Veronique and Simon's presentation. But we would also like very much to hear from you, so either from London or from the online audience. Hence, there will be around 45 minutes for Q&A following the presentation. So hold your thoughts and questions for the Q&A session. We will open the floor to you after the presentation, and we'll finish the meeting with a wrap up by the panelists, so they could share with us their final thought, reflecting what you contributed to the discussion. Enough with me. Veronique, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I've been asked to give you a bit of background on the research that we've conducted here at HPG for the last 2 years. So we wanted to look at what happens to markets in crisis, not in terms of doing any kinds of humanitarian interventions, but actually understanding how markets, which are so important to people's livelihoods and lives, are adapting, changing when a crisis hits. So we've done 3 case studies, one on South Sudan and the current conflict, one on Mali and the most recent conflict, and one on the 2010 floods in Sindh in Pakistan. So my presentation will give you, if you want, a snapshot of some of the findings that we have in the reports. I won't go through everything, it's quite a lot. But we thought we should exemplify what the details of some of those mechanisms and some of those changing adaptations that happen to markets, what are they and why they're important. So my first point is looking at the actual impact of the crisis on markets. So we found through the 3 case studies very different types of impacts and some trends, which is not unexpected. Within the same case studies, we found markets and commodities that reacted very differently. Again, I think not something new for people who've worked on market assessments in crisis. But what it did, it highlighted the many issues that should be looked at and should inform the design of relief and recovery programs. And it's in the details and the more subtleties of those different changes and adaptations that we find the key important information. So to give you an example, we looked at the millet market in Mali. And what we did, we didn't go to the areas that were directly affected by the conflict, but we went to Mopti, which is just on the verge of where the conflict was happening. So the millet market in Mali, it's a credit market. It's a credit market that's based on long-standing relationships. So if you want people who trade millet, trade with the same people usually that they have traded with for many years. They trade on credit, so they buy usually half of the commodities on credit, half not on credits, and before they can buy the next batch of cereals, they need to repay part or the whole of that credit. So what happened when the conflict broke out is that chain of credit completely crumbled, partly because people were displaced, because traders were displaced, or because of death also. But what you see happening in the market is, because the market is organized in that chain of credit, is a very wide network of traders were then impacted and affected by the conflict, and not just in conflict-affected areas of Mali, but also on the verge of those areas, and within a wider network of, from producing regions all the way up to the conflict-affected areas. So in Mopti, we saw traders that had no money to replenish their stock, and that had important implications for displaced people that came to Mopti, as well as more vulnerable people living in Mopti, because they also rely on the credit that those traders give them to be able to sustain themselves. So why the credit chain was broken was because there was no longer any trust in the market to be able to give credit out to a trader to buy the cereals, sell them, and then give back the money to the creditor. But what was interesting, and that's where the details and the intricacies are important, is people kept on talking about, there is no trust, there is a lack of trust, there is no longer any trust in the market chain. But then when I was asking, is there no trust because you don't trust that person personally? And they said, no, it's in the situation that we're not trusting. And part of that reason was because of the aid being delivered in the north. So if you want, the northern markets were no longer being replenished with cereals because the credit chain was broken and those traders were no longer able to send millet up north. And at the same time, the delivery of aid was continuing and exacerbating this lack of trust in the situation for the credit chain to be reformed. And this was a further blockage to being able to restart the trade flow to the north and helping the populations that were in the north be able to feed themselves. Which leads me to my second point. One of the things that we found as well through the studies was that the delivery of aid was impacting markets much more than we thought. And not just delivering of aid through Inkind aid, as is the case in Mali, but also local procurement that was done without doing a market analysis, without understanding how the market was structured. So in Pakistan, to give you an example, there was large-scale local procurement of bamboo to rebuild shelter destroyed by the floods in 2010. Again, the bamboo market is a credit market and is based on trading with the same traders and through personal relationship. But with you met an organization coming into the market and asking and buying locally building material, the market was completely overwhelmed with the demand. It was not just overwhelmed with the demand, it was also overwhelmed with the way that international organizations were trying to buy the bamboo. So the international organizations were new actors on the market. They were not the long-standing traders that bamboo traders were used to dealing with. And most importantly, they asked for forward financing. So instead of having a credit market, you suddenly have a market where you as a trader has to provide bamboo, and the international organization repays you 20, 30 days after that. And most of the traders on the market did not have the capacity to do that kind of forward financing. They also didn't have the capacity to respond to the type of bureaucratic and document procedures that the international organizations were asking. So the way the market responded to that issue was with agents and middlemen that stepped in to play the role of financing, providing credit, and also filling in the bureaucratic requirements that the organizations were asking for. So basically, you have the same traders on the market trading bamboo, but instead of trading directly and selling directly to international organizations, you now have those new agents in the middle negotiating between the traders and the international organizations. But what was interesting and what we found through the study is that this created a 50% increase in the cost of building material. And that 50% was not given to the traders. That's basically the price of having those agents and middlemen in the middle doing that negotiations between the international organizations and the traders, and distorting completely the way the market was functioning prior to the crisis. And if you want, just to give you an idea, a 50% increase in price just for forward financing is pretty much 6,000% annual rate for a credit. So we're talking about a huge increase. So here you have a situation where local procurement actually led to a lot of inefficiency in terms of procuring building materials by the humanitarian organizations, who were paying a much higher cost. But it had also impacts on the structure of the market, with smaller traders going out of business, not being able to remain within the market. And there was also an impact on the types and quality of bamboo that was available on the market because of the requirements that the international organizations were asking. The third point I wanted to touch on is the interaction between aid, market, and conflict. Through our South Sudan case study, we found some really interesting links between the conflict dynamics, war economy, markets, and the way aid intervenes. And that led us to really think about the importance of doing conflict analysis within market analysis and doing market analysis within conflict analysis, and why it's important to have those two types of analysis linked to each other. So in South Sudan, you have a market where pretty much all staple food is imported into the country, which means that there is a huge role in the market for foreign exchange and access to foreign currency. But the foreign currency market in South Sudan is actually quite restricted, and with the conflict became even more restricted, and not everybody was able to access foreign currency. What you have an elite that's able to access foreign currency at a certain rate, at a preferable rate, because they have the kind of networks with political powers, and on the other hand, you have competitors that get less favorable rates on the black market. And this really puts into questions this idea of support to the private sector. And when you do a cash intervention or when you work with the private sector in a country such as South Sudan, who are you really working with? And there was a risk through the analysis revealed there was a risk of feeding the war economy by doing cash interventions in a way that didn't take into account those wider political economy issues. And while it doesn't mean that it does, it shouldn't happen, at least it's a risk that needs to be evaluated. If you're going to be doing cash through humanitarian interventions, are you actually, how is that impacting or playing into this war economy issue? It also highlighted the importance of looking at markets as systems and networks and following the money. And not just looking at the marketplace. So not just looking at, I work in this small area of South Sudan, and so I'm interested in that market and understanding what's happening in that market, but actually following the money and following the chain of the commodity to really understand what is happening and how you're interacting with the markets. My colleague will talk further about the implications of our research, but what, for me, the research really highlighted was there's a need to look at markets and understand what's happening to markets, and understand how and why markets are adapting and changing the way they are, and what the implications of those changes are for conflict-affected or crisis-affected populations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronique. Simon?
Thanks. So, if we accept that market activity always carries on throughout a crisis in some form or other, and if, as we discover when we look in detail at what goes on in a crisis with humanitarian aid, we're forced to recognise that basically whatever you do, you could call it a market intervention. Any form of aid will have some kind of impact on a market. So everything we do is a market intervention. So the question then becomes, when is it really necessary to have good market understanding as a humanitarian? And on the basis of our analysis, we think that there are three situations where it's critical, and that is always, always, and always. And there's a certain paradox here, because actually we very rarely try and get it. The only time when if you're almost mandatory to have some kind of market understanding is if we're doing cash. Which is kind of a paradox, because cash doesn't actually distort markets. Cash works through the market. And in all of the examples that we did study, we found that actually cash, it was the in-kind aid which is far more distorting of a market, and yet currently we don't regard it as being necessary to understand markets in order to hand out stuff. Now, is that a paradox? Not really. It's madness? Not really. I think it betrays something underlying, which is actually quite sad, which is that actually what we are really interested in as a sector is our own projects. Because if I want to give out stuff, what happens to the market doesn't affect the stuff that people get. So I can control my project without understanding the market. The fact that it actually messes up people's lives is kind of here or there, because I don't report back on that, I report back on my project. So I think that there is some kind of underlying malaise in our sector, which is revealed by that. So that's when we need to do it. What is it that we really need to look at if we want to get good market understanding? And here, sadly, I don't have anything comforting to offer. Because a market is not a place, it's not a marketplace. I mean, it's very, very, very easy to go down to the local market in Mali to see, is the millet there or is it not there, and what's the price? Anyone can do that. If you want to understand the market, a market as a system, they've got very, very long chains. You've got to follow the trade all the way back, possibly to other countries, and from there, maybe another third country which is where the produce will end up. You've also got to follow the money. I mean, Vero was talking a little bit about this flow of credit. So you've got flows of money, you've got flows of credit, you've got flows of... That's a real challenge for humanitarian, because I'm over here, the people are dying, I've got to help them, go to the market, and someone says, no, actually, you've really got to understand over the border what's going to happen to production, and you've also got to understand, it's like, by the time I do that, the baby will... So that's a real challenge for us, is that how do you do a humanitarian assessment when basically you're told it's got to be a full regional study? Secondly, and again highlighted very much by Vero, is the what is easy. That's kind of sort of basic data, but we have to understand the why. if a price goes down, is that good or bad? I mean, if you look at the food security bulletins that come out, whenever a price goes down, great news. Whenever a price goes up, really bad news. Oh, is that naive and superficial? I hope not. There's one lovely example in South Sudan. Price of food went down at the beginning of the crisis. Wonderful, food security safe. No, all the traders are getting out of there as fast as they can and they're selling off their stock at any price. If you know what's going on and why they're doing it, you know that the fall in price is actually a warning sign that things are going to get bad very quickly. Surprise, surprise, they did. So that's the challenge for humanitarians, because that kind of detailed and sophisticated understanding is not the kind of thing that we humanitarians usually have. Then the other problem is it's no good understanding today, because today doesn't really exist. Because by the time you do anything, you're into tomorrow. And today is really only today because of yesterday. So we've got to understand markets don't happen on a day. Market happens over time, they're dynamic. So I've got to understand trends. Why is the price today what it is? It's what happened 3 months ago, 6 months ago. Seasonal. But again, wonderful food security bulletins we get. Oh, the price of maize went up by 23.6% in August. Good or bad? Does it always do that? Does it usually go up by more? So I need a historical perspective to understand anything I'm getting out of a market. That's a challenge for a humanitarian, because we're new. I mean, I only flew in because the babies are dying. Don't ask me about what happened. What country am I in? I look at my passport to know what country I'm in, yeah? The visa stamp. That's kind of how we work. So that's a real, real challenge for us. What are we going to use this? If we were able to do it, what are we going to use it for? Well, at the moment, we tend to do it to kind of make that choice, cash or in kind. Which is a bit sad, really. Because if we actually understood what was going on to markets in crisis, I mean, markets are actually not really about us. They're about it's about how needs are created, about how people meet their needs. This is people's economic lives. If we understood that, we might understand more about their economic lives. If we understood that, we might understand where we need to help, which might not be quite where the earthquake was or where the flood is. It might be downstream or upstream in market terms, not water terms, where we need to intervene. Knowing who we need to help, knowing how to help, all of these things depend on good market information. So we need to get much, much better, not only about having understanding, but also about knowing how to use it. All right, that's that. So what are the implications also for what we should then do? Yeah? What does market smart aid look like? The thing that really came across very, very clearly, and it is something that a lot of us know, and the reason why I guess some of us are in this room is because we've been banging on about it for 15, 20 years almost, which is kind of around this whole cash versus in-kind thing. But I personally, I've been banging on about cash for what? Yeah, 14, 15 years. And even I was surprised at just how deadly in-kind aid is. Yeah? The negative impacts in all, which is not to say never do it and always do cash. In the studies that we did, almost all of the negative impacts of aid were caused because it was in kind and would not have happened if cash had been given. So what the figure we were given by the high-level panel is what, 6% at the moment of aid is. I'll feel happier when it's 94. It doesn't just, we kind of always known it depresses production. I mean, that's one of these things that we're always told about. And it reduces demand. The way in which it reduced the confidence, in this credit chain Vera was talking about, that for me was really interesting. And the other thing which is really interesting is the way in which in-kind aid, especially when it's local purchase, which is often presented as being less market distorting. Yeah, right. Go to Pakistan and go to Mali and have a look at the way in which we have actually distorted the market completely. What some people, the actors who are there and who are present, completely different. Now, no harm in new actors coming into a market. It would be nice if we actually understood what we were doing and made a rational, deliberate choice to support that rather than it happening without us knowing. A second, I think, implication for the humanitarian agencies on what market smart aid is something that we're calling among ourselves a whole of aid approach. We're spending an awful lot of money. Why can't we use that as a totality to achieve objectives? Because this kind of business of projectizing our objectives, we know it's wrong. But I don't think we realise quite how bad it is. If we look at how we bought, Bill was talking about these agents coming in. And why do they come in? Because I have to tender in the most administratively cheap way, yeah? Which means I need a big tender. I can't start messing about with 5,000 suppliers. I've got to do it big. They've got to fulfill my compliance standards, yeah? So I need this, I need a performance, and they need to be registered. Yeah, or it's a long list of conditions which basically rule out any legitimate player currently working in the market. So it's absolutely inevitable that I'm going to destroy a market sector by doing this. So why on earth do we do it? And again, is it madness? I'd like to think so. If it was naivety or madness, we could at least, have a sort of some kind of plausible, take the medicine, go on the course, you'll be fine. I think there's something slightly worse going on, which is that we use the language of of value for money and trying to reduce the cost of aid, but we've just had the example of actually doubled the cost of aid. We're far, far cheaper to have worked intensively with smaller suppliers and pre-financed them and bought at the normal price. So why don't we do it? And I think I've got an explanation which is quite simple. If I put in more time on administering a contract, that comes off the administrative budget line. That is money spent on myself, which is bad. If I pay twice the market price for stuff, I have doubled the amount of money that I spend on victims, and that's good, because I've actually done more. Well, what kind of warped world have I done more by paying twice the price for, in order to save 5% on higher administration? So I think there's something quite... Now, it's not to say that anyone is being deliberately nasty. The system, the bureaucratic system is making a rational choice, one which is, which is only rational in the Alice Through the Looking Glass or Alice in Wonderland worlds in which we live, and I think we sometimes oscillate between those two, and I'm never sure which one we're in. The third implication, I think, for humanitarian agencies has been touched on already by Vero, so I won't speak about it a lot, and that is this whole idea. There's a huge momentum now behind partnership with the private sector. Everywhere you look, partnership with the private sector. And it's quite interesting that the market debate and this private sector bandwagon are actually quite separate. And you might think, that's a bit odd, isn't it? Because isn't markets and the private sector the same thing? I don't think it's odd at all. I think some really serious, incredibly constructive stuff is going on in the markets. We're actually analysing what's really going on. And there's an awful lot of, I'm streamed online, I'm allowed to say bullshit. I've said it. There's an awful lot of complete vacuous bullshit going on in this other world where we use very, very generalities. If our goal should be to try and help economic activity to come back again. But the idea that there is a private sector, singular, which I can partner with, well, when we know this ourselves, in any possible market, it's the whole point about the private sector is it's competitive. Every player in the market is competing with every other player. So who are you going to partner with? Oh, all of them. Right, but you can't partner with the little old lady selling 5 sticks of bamboo on the end of the road. It's administratively inefficient. We know who gets a voice. We know who can find their way and who speaks the right language to get into our meetings, to become the voice of the private sector. And it's very, very often far from being the kind of market activity and the kind of players that maybe as humanitarians we ought to worry a little bit more about. Final point, because I will finish. I do sometimes. Which is that can market smart aid bring humanitarians and development people together? Now we've kind of got a little bit of a mix of us here. We haven't fought each other yet, it's good. And there is this divide. I've kind of got this vague dream. I'll wake up one day maybe. Got this vague dream that markets actually, this is fantastic, only the last few years humanitarians have thought, I've got to think about markets. And the pace at which we've developed, we've got tools, we're building up libraries, communities of practice, we're trying to think about market smart programming and so on. I think it's absolutely incredible. I've got this vision that actually this is a stepping stone to leaving that age behind, and we are going to move into the golden age, the last age. And the last age, the reason why I call it the last age, is because finally, and I think it is for the first time, a humanitarian is no longer just kind of looking at a victim. They're no longer looking at the needs of a victim. they're actually thinking about the economic context that people affected by crisis live in. So it's not just about, what are their coping strategies, what are they doing? No, it's like, what are they doing in what economic context? Now, the key thing about that is that for the first time, I think, humanitarians have got on their radar exactly the same field of vision. Is that a mixed metaphor? You have a field of vision on radar? No? They have exactly the same field of vision on their radar as the so-called development people. And I don't think that's ever happened before. Now, if that happens, then just maybe, whether you're working short-term to deal with a short-term acute need, or you're dealing long-term to deal with long-term structural problems, those will always remain separate tasks, separate responsibilities maybe, but you're no longer in a separate sector. So just maybe, the walls are going to come crumbling down. Or maybe I'll wake up. That's it.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think I'm going to leave you with the easy task to react to what Simon and Veronique have just said. Emily, are you happy to start with sharing your thoughts?
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk on the basis of my personal experience of working in and on markets in crisis in the past years. So I think what both of you have been saying right now are fundamental statements about markets. Markets are affected by crisis. Markets still function in crisis in different degrees. Aid affects markets in different degrees and different ways. And conflict come on the way in the interaction of aid and markets. And those are based on evidence, and they are fundamentally in line with all what recent researchers or recent studies have been producing. I can't see any of my experiences, though they are not representative of the whole sector, but any of my experiences that would question that. So then the question for me is, why have I spent the past years trying to justify to my colleagues why we should understand markets when we design humanitarian response, or why we should support some small traders in Haiti so that they are able to resupply basic needs to the affected population in the neighborhood, and they're able to reinstate the credit relation, the informal credit relation. So why should we keep justifying that, actually? And how can we still get away with not always analyzing markets, or even worse, having the market assessment but not following the recommendations, which happens? So for me, I think I would imagine that bringing the question of how markets affect and support people will actually help us close the loop. Yeah, how is it that people can access or not their basic goods in a crisis? Can they access them in quantity? In what are the terms in which they can access them? Can they still access credit that is fundamental, is a fundamental aspect of safety nets for their livelihoods? Can they access water? Can they access sanitation? Can they access any aspect of their protection also? I think that is a question that will maybe help us close the loop. And there is evidence out there that is coming out. There is evidence around the economic multipliers of humanitarian aid. It's coming up that, yes, when we deliver certain modalities, certain ways, it can create economic rejuvenation. It can help economic growth. But what we don't know yet, or we don't know really much, is how that is redistributed, right? We don't know how much of that gets into the hands of the affected populations. We don't know how that economic multiplier comes back to them. So the question for us should be, is there any way in which we can deliver aid that can optimize those economic multipliers, that economic rejuvenation? Is there any way that we can contribute to it? I think that what the studies that you have carried out and what the evidence is telling us is that the question is legitimate. This is not outside of humanitarian imperative, mandate, or remit. I think the question is there and it's valid. But now what is missing is evidence for us to answer to it. How do we do humanitarian aid that, when possible and as possible, contributes to economic recovery in a way that benefits the affected population, because it's part indeed of their daily life. So I think that one of our focuses should be in producing researches, action research. The community of practice today is struggling in finding information, in finding practice, in even defining what we call humanitarian market support. And this is an illustration, I think, that we should be expanding on that. I even think that ultimately we should have some economic and socioeconomic markers within the humanitarian impact or humanitarian outcome indicators, but that's maybe for the next step. In addition to that, I would like to react on the tools and the assessment aspect. I have been in the battleground of the market tools for the past years, of the humanitarian market tools, and I have been in the middle of, which tool, what tool, that tool, not that tool, in which context, and why not, and this one is not good, and that one. I personally think that the tools we have are great. They can do what they need to do. They follow the money. They are detailed and sophisticated. They follow the long chains. What is missing or what is not yet completely there, and by the way, they have been developed on the basis of development tools and by the people who had the best practice and the best knowledge. But what is missing are the skills, the time, and the scale. The skills is we humanitarians have to stop thinking that we can do it all and have to do it all and have to know it all. We don't have to. We just need to be good at what we do. The skills are out there. Out there you have development people who know how to do that, private sector companies, consultancy groups who know how to map markets, who know how to do power analysis in the market, how to do political economy analysis. So everything is there. You have market intelligence analysis that are going on, so everything is out there. It's how to bring the right mix. Scale. At this stage, assessments are disconnected, isolated, and even if they follow the chain, they still remain small assessments. What we need is to look at it at a much bigger picture and to connect the local to the global. Be in a situation where we integrate the assessments we do, where we can share information, transparency is critical, and where we can look at it from a much more system approach. I think preparedness has helped us a lot. Looking at markets before the crisis is really helping us, but we should bring that at a much bigger scale. The skills, the methods are out there to model risk, to model markets reactions. We should use that, and most probably it would be a cost saving if we bring all of that together instead of doing it separately. I totally agree that this will be one of the hopefully final battlegrounds between humanitarian and development, and Jo and I used to sit a bit closer on the table when we worked in Oxfam. So I think that it is the place where we want to be in the development market analysis to bring risk and have shock responsive development. We want development people to come into market systems that don't necessarily have development opportunities. Those of imported rice or water where there is no development capacity, but this is what people consume and this is what people need to get their lives going on. So ultimately, I haven't been there for 15 or 20 years, but yeah, we have been discussing this, and you can see papers that have been written at the end of the 90s saying exactly that we can use humanitarian aid to rejuvenate markets, that we can work together on this. So how do we get change? That's my question. How do we get this technical conversation into a more strategic and political arena? I think we can probably learn from other innovations. And I think our ambition should be to get markets out of the innovation box. Thanks.
On this very inspiring end line, I'm going to give the floor to Jo.
Gosh, I don't think anybody's left much more to say. So I'm probably just going to restate things in my words, since they've been so clearly articulated. But I think to summarize, but to also agree with what the previous panelists have said, to me, one thing that's really important to remember is that for humanitarian and development sectors, markets are a means to an end. They're not the end themselves. And I think that's something that is very easy to forget, no matter where you sit, when you're actually becoming a practitioner. And what does that mean? It means that markets are part of a wider system. And I think that that's been one of the real values of working with markets. Not only what they have allowed us to do in terms of moving some of the humanitarian and development programming forward, but to start, if you like, understanding and modeling systems better. It's a very simple, it provides some very simple, as Emily said, loads of great tools which help to understand and help to see and help to analyze and help to change the way in which we're programming. But having said that, that's probably not quite gone far enough. Because I think that what we need to see, given everything that's been said, is a real shift, a paradigm shift in the humanitarian approaches. There is an opportunity to do this with so much new innovation that is around, and some of the ways in which both the humanitarian and development sectors are interacting with some of that innovation, be that in IT, be that in this field of social enterprise, be that in what we call the age of networking, wherever. But I think for me at least, the question remains, how can we go further? How can we do that better? How can we do more? And again, how can we see markets as part of the wider system? So it's not about food markets, it's about the food system. It's not about a particular market, a financial market, it's about how the entire system works. And then how that affects different groups of people in different circumstances. Different circumstances which change in a crisis. It might be a developmental context one day, and then a crisis occurs, and it suddenly becomes a crisis. But there's a continuum here of the way in which the system works, the way in which the system impacts, the way in which markets are affected by that crisis, and critically how people are affected and then can interact with markets, which are one element of that system. So it's very complex, and I think markets help us find some of the tools, some of the ways of unpacking that complexity, but it's only one stage of going to that higher level of understanding how the system works and how people interact with that system and the environment interacts with that system. So I think a lot of this has been said, but for me, the question is then, how can we better understand and use the business of markets better to help people? How can we, and that's the bigger we, as society, work together better to deliver, not only in crisis, but in the world, to what people need and what vulnerable people, which I think is our remit in particular, what vulnerable people need, and helps them move forward and helps them to help themselves move forward. How can we change the system? How can we influence the system so that people can help themselves, people are better off, and that perhaps they can have an influence over the system so that these crises don't happen in the first place. And yes, markets are a critical part of that, an economic part of it, which interacts with other aspects that then in turn influence the way in which markets act. This whole question of the power in markets, how do people interrelate with each other, who has more power, the elites that Veronique pointed out, and how does that influence the markets as well as the system more broadly. And coming back to this question of markets and markets analysis, and what is our role in that analysis as humanitarian or development actors? I think that's a very good question, because can we ever, as Simon says, ever analyze in time to respond in time for something to happen before the next thing has happened? I think in the way in which we are set up as the humanitarian development sector, we were going to be behind the curve. We're going to be one step behind what's actually happening. What's actually happening is down to the people in that system. So what our role really has to ultimately be is how to empower this people within the system to act and to be able to work together to benefit those people we want to work most efficiently. So it's not about the tools, it's not about the markets just on their own, it's not about understanding the markets perhaps, as much as taking the lessons from markets approaches, those elements that are most relevant in the context where we work, and learning how to apply those and work with those. Yeah, just a few points for thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very dense in terms of information, question, everything. So now it's time for questions, comments that you may have, and I already see a few hands up. So what we will do is that we'll be taking 3 to 4 questions first from the room, then from online if there are any. So either you have a question for a specific member of the panel who will then answer it, or you let me in charge of directing the question to the lucky panel member who will be tasked to answer it.